Thanks, John. I appreciate it a lot. Brian, great talk. It's hard to follow. too many pretty pictures of oceans and fish and things. I know, it's really hard. I can tell you though that had a paper of yours with squirrels and squirrelfish cross my editorial desk as a mammalogist, I would have accepted it immediately. Sorry about that. So, let's see, how do I advance this? What do I use? Will that do it? Okay. Continental biotas. I took a little bit of a different approach than Brian did to developing this talk. I think you'll see why. I hope so as I go along, because I think I get the sense that the range of topics that continental comparative phylogeographers have approached over the last 30 years are a little more diffuse conceptually in some ways than the ocean phylogeographers. So it's a broader picture, I think, and I think I want to just both leave you with a sense of where a scan of the field in several different ways, and then a sense of where it might be going in the future. Let's go all the way back to the master, Alfred Russel Wallace. You know him for island work, but in fact, he did develop our terrestrial biogeographic regions that we largely still use today, developing on Philip Sclater's earlier work. Sclater never gets recognition, but he ought to. But he was also interested in processes as well as patterns. He made some really interesting observations about transition zones, one between the Neotropics and Nearctic in Central America, for example, that called upon geologists to catch up, basically, with the biologists. That was pretty forward-thinking for his time. He was also interested in the effect of barriers, and he speculated, for example, on different zoological districts that occurred on either side of the Rockies and the Andes. He had mostly data on mammals, but other organisms as well. And he wrote a famous paper on the effect of rivers in the Neotropics on monkeys, okay? And he scolded biogeographers and natural historians at the time for not collecting accurate enough data to know which side of the river their specimens came from. So he was very forward-thinking in that way, and he was very interested in what he called the glacial epoch. He had no belief at all that continents moved around the globe. He was very much a stable Earth guy, but he was very interested in the effect of the glacial epoch. Now, you know, after spending a good deal of time talking and thinking about continental biotas, he turned his attention mostly to islands. And the reason he did this in perhaps his best book, Island Life, their books were always very long-winded in their titles at the time, or The Phenomena and Causes of Insular Faunas and Floras, including a revision and attempted solution of the problem of geological climates. That's a paragraph, that's not a title. But at any rate, it says a lot about what he was interested in. He liked islands because of their discrete boundaries and biotic simplicity. Biogeographers today still like islands for the same reason. And then he said something very interesting in Island Life. He said, "We shall find it comparatively easy to deal with the more complex and less clearly defined problems of continental distribution by studying islands." So he was interested in islands as models that could apply more generally. Now, that doesn't mean that biogeographers stopped studying continental biotas throughout the 20th century. They studied things like geographic isolation and speciation, morphological variation within species, the effects of Pleistocene climate cycles and distributional shifts of entire biotas. Very famous model of speciation in Pleistocene refugia in the tropics. Suture zones, very well-known study. and of course biotic interchange between different biogeographic regions. So these kinds of things did continue to be studied throughout the 20th century. Answers were not always very satisfying, though, because of a clear lack of resolution in the data, oftentimes. Birmingham and Avise, Brian took you back to 1992. I would take you back to 1986, actually, where they did not actually coin the term comparative phylogeography, but one of John's former students, Biff Birmingham, did this famous study in 1986 that compared a revolutionary study using mitochondrial DNA. Looking at intraspecific divergence in the southeast, in rivers, freshwater rivers in the southeast between 4 co-distributed species, and found some surprising level of geographic congruence in their splits, okay? Now, obviously, since then, we all know, and there was a comment a few minutes ago, that a motivation for phylogeography in the first place is that these molecular data were uncovering a whole bunch of cryptic divergence within morphologically conservative taxa, species and species groups. And so that got things off in the right direction. And what I want to do here today is I want to give you a scan, an overview of what I think the status of continental comparative phylogeography is today, looking at the context, the content, and maybe some of the novelty involved in using this approach to biogeography. And then we'll spend a few minutes looking at some case histories and some case studies about that might give us something to talk about later in terms of future trends. All right? Okay, building the database, just a minute here. How did I do this? I went to the Web of Science, and I downloaded everything on the Web of Science that had the words comparative phylogeography, truncated, phylogeographic, phylogeography, and then beyond that, co-distributed or co-distributed, and I came up with about 704 titles and abstracts. Now, I had to then go through and visually inspect that and weed out those that did not apply to continental systems, that were islands and marine systems and so forth. And then there were a number, what Web of Science gives you as a keywords plus feature that gives you keywords that simply appear in the titles of references that are cited in a paper. So I still had to do a scan there and actually decide which of those papers actually qualified as what I would consider comparative phylogeography rather than individual species phylogeography papers. This is a real pain. Yeah. Anyway. And then as I went through, continued going through this database, there were still a few I had to weed out that actually did apply to islands and that sort of thing. And I came up with 455 papers. Okay, titles and abstracts. Now, one caveat is that this is a sampling. I don't try to be exhaustive here. It's a sampling of the literature. And it's not going to pick up papers that don't have these words in the search. And I know this personally, for example, because I didn't pick up a couple of my own papers. And because they were my own papers, I added them afterwards. And I could add a couple of papers that I knew about afterwards, but I know I didn't get everything out there, so it's a sampling. But I think I don't have any reason to suspect that it's not a sort of a more or less random and representative sampling of the literature, okay? I don't think it's really biased in any particular sense. So, another thing that, to explain is that a lot of the papers actually do look superficially like single taxon rather than comparative papers. Quite a few of them, actually, but if you go through and read the entire abstract and possibly go to the paper itself, you can often get the read deeper and realize that it would be a single taxon paper that actually is embedded within a system that has been looked at previously from additional taxa perspective, or minimally interprets the results based on co-distributed taxa. So I left those in, okay, and considered those qualified as comparative phylogeography type papers. All right, so after doing all of this, the first thing I want to do, and here is where I think the marine phylogeographers can ask whether or not this entire range of topics is also covered equally in the marine realm. It might be interesting to talk about that later. But I divided I wanted to just get a sense of the overall language and concepts of continental comparative phylogeography. I came up with several large categories: speciation, and then a bunch of words that I would search the database with embedded within each of these categories: contact, hybrid zones, and so forth, evolution and ecology, adaptation, niches, population level, population structure, population genetic, and so forth, geography, allopatric, sympatric, parapatric, paraepatric, and responses to Earth history, vicariance, dispersal, range dynamics, and so forth. So I'll show you a bunch of pie diagrams, and I'm not going to dwell on these. I don't know how interesting they are, actually. But there's something interesting in some of these, I think. Within speciation, divergence is sort of an overwhelming word. These are not, these are the total number of times, in this case, that these words appear in this database. It's not just the total number of papers, okay? I didn't spend that much time on it. I didn't think it was necessary for this purpose. But speciation, diversification are big. Within contact category, hybridization, hybrids, introgression, introgressed, admixture is a big one, and contact zone. Within evolution ecology, biodiversity, adaptation, adapted, that sort of thing. Niche is a big word that people use. At the population level, gene flow, demography, demographic, population genetic structure, population structure. Kind of surprisingly, within geography, a whole bunch of hits on endemic and endemism. I didn't think that was something that phylogeographers specifically used. I know biogeographers do, historical biogeographers, but that came up a lot. And then allopatry and sympatry about the same. Parapatric, parapatric, not very much. Responses to Earth history, again, one overriding, overwhelming word is refuge and refugia, okay? And then beyond that, dispersal is bigger than vicariance. Range expansion is up there. And then if I put all of those major categories together and lump all of those hits, I get more or less equivalent, except for the contact zone, sort of partitioning among all of those categories. So that's just kind of an idea of what the language and concepts are that continental phylogeographers are using, okay? I don't pretend that those to be all of the terms, just the ones I thought of. All right, maybe a little bit more interesting is an overview of where continental comparative phylogeographers work, actually. I'm going to do a lot of this based on, again, as Brian did, biogeographic provinces in the marine realm. The biogeographic regions in a terrestrial realm is a nice way to break down this, this sense of where things happen. I use as a baseline not Wallace's original map, but an update by Holger Kreft and Walter Jetz in 2010. The boundaries of the regions changed a little bit. The regions themselves did not. It was more convenient than an even more recent update by Holt et al. In Science a few years ago that actually named some of these transitional areas as separate biogeographic regions. I didn't want to go to that level, okay? So this is a nice one. It's a pretty picture. Okay, so the review by Hickerson et al. In 2010, a number of you in here were on that paper, noted specifically, based on some other papers, that the southern hemisphere had not received as much attention as the northern hemisphere in comparative phylogeographic studies at that time. So I wanted to ask if that's still true. These are the total number of studies by biogeographic region as I tabulate them in different regions. And here's a graph through time of what comparative phylogeography on continents. And you can see that the northern hemisphere, the Nearctic and Palearctic are still pretty big. Everything's increasing after the early part of the 2000s. But there is a decided increase in the southern hemisphere as well, okay? The Oriental region is lagging, but others are doing pretty well. And if you put all of the southern sort of regions together, more or less by hemisphere versus the northern, if indeed it's the case that the southern hemisphere was lagging, it looks like it's kind of catching up. So that's good news. And that's driven primarily by neotropical and Australian regions, but the others are in there as well. Okay, so just very quickly, relationships between taxa, as John said, there are different ways to kind of look at the word comparative. And if you just look at it from a sort of taxonomic point of view or a geographic taxonomic point of view, most studies obviously are just simply geographically co-distributed taxa, okay, without any obvious ecological or biological relationships between them. A number of studies do have some explicit ecological affinities. They might be part of a trophic guild. They might be occupying a similar habitat. But these are a little bit more sophisticated, asking a little bit different kind of a question than simply being co-distributed taxa. And then a fair number of studies actually, it turns out, to be between obligate biological taxa, host parasite taxa, plant pollinator type taxa. And if you just look at that last category, this would be sort of the breakdown by biogeographic region. And so that's a fair number that did that. I won't take that any further. I'll just leave that for you to look at. Now, there's this other idea of hotspots of activity that also was identified in the Hickerson et al. Paper. A hotspot of phylogeographic activity would have more than one, I don't know what, maybe two is a hotspot, studies that address a similar biogeographic region or subregion, a piece of real estate with a different group of taxa each time, okay? And these definitely do get going and do have their own sort of level of interest, I think. These are the ones that were identified by Hickerson et al. In 2010. And you can see that there are some, I don't know, 7 or 8 of these in different regions of the world. Not much in the southern hemisphere. They kind of lumped all of the Palearctic into Europe, and several in different parts of North America. Now, whether or not I was just being a little bit pickier, or whether there has indeed been a proliferation of what I would consider hotspots or emerging hotspots, I think I've identified quite a few more around the world. Okay, in North America, I think Rockies and Central America are added to the others that were identified by Hickerson et al. In the Palearctic, I think there are, you can imagine, you can generate a sense of a number of different hotspots of activity at this point. Many in the Western Palearctic, but a few in Eurasia and Eastern Palearctic as well. Australia is well represented, okay? Obviously the Australian wet tropics got off to an early start. but southwestern Australia, southeast Australia are quite well represented. The deserts in the Endorheic basins are pretty well represented at this point. The neotropics are quite well represented up in the north, Patagonia in the south, not as much between Patagonia and Amazonia, and then Transandean and lower Central America. Those are all pretty well represented by lots of papers. And Ethiopia is getting pretty well represented at this point. The eastern arc, Afromontane mountains are quite well represented. The Central African forest in West Africa are pretty well represented, okay? And then, interestingly, there are transition zones between regions that are pretty well represented. There's not much in the Orient itself at this point, but sort of the transition, the Tibet Plateau, Eastern Himalayas between the Palearctic and the Orient is getting some attention. The Mediterranean basin between the Ethiopian and Palearctic regions is getting some attention. The neotropical, Nearctic transition zone is getting attention. And Palearctic, Nearctic via Beringia is getting quite a bit of attention at this point. Okay, so this is sort of just a summary of the hotspots. Again, Oriental is pretty lagging. The transitions between these regions, really nothing detectable in India and much of the Middle East. By the way, just to comment on it, Antarctica has its own phylogeography study, comparative phylogeography study now, believe it or not. Anyway. Okay, time frames explored by continental biogeographers. I broke these down into 3 different time frames to look at: the Neogene, the Quaternary, and the late glacial, post-glacial, primarily because those are the time frames that the phylogeographers themselves use, but also because mechanistically there are different sort of episodes of Earth history where things are dominant, drivers are dominant in these different time frames. Okay, so within a late glacial, post-glacial time frame, this is the total number of papers. And well represented relative to the Quaternary total, late glacial, post-glacial, in all of the biogeographic regions. The total Neogene and Quaternary representation looks like this. Quaternary obviously is more frequent than Neogene, but Neogene plus Quaternary gets a fair representation in some biogeographic regions. Neogene itself does not get a lot of representation, so you're kind of running out of what people call a phylogeographic time frame as you get farther and farther back in the Cenozoic. We all knew that. But there's overlap between the Neogene and the Quaternary in what you would consider, sort of simplistically climatic versus geological drivers. The Neogene was really at the time of geological uplift and extension, erosion, and so forth, incision, canyons forming, that sort of thing. Climate change has been happening throughout that entire period and really plunges into the colder Pleistocene glacial interglacial times, sort of towards the end of the Pliocene. But so you have an interaction between climate and geology, followed by, once you get later into the Quaternary, really just climate drivers. And this is what the total looks like, climate versus geology. And geology is fairly well represented. Climate is obviously the big motivator for many of these studies. The biotic responses themselves to Earth history are summarized as vicariance and or dispersal, refugia, and range dynamics, expansion, contraction, and shifting, okay? So these are the 3 categories I looked at. Vicariance and or dispersal, this is the data set. Dispersal is big everywhere. Vicariance is pretty big in Australia, not so big in the Palearctic, but vicariance plus dispersal occurs almost everywhere except the Orient. Small sample size in the Orient, though. Refugia and range dynamics, obviously, as I said before, refugia is a big topic, and refugia plus range dynamics is a pretty big topic everywhere, okay? except the neotropics. Neotropics don't, they talk about refugia, but not range dynamics as much. Okay, so to summarize that, vicariance is disproportionately popular in the Australian region. It's not as popular in the Palearctic region. And refugia are popular everywhere, but not really connected to range dynamics as much in the neotropical region. It's kind of interesting. Taxa that are being explored by comparative phylogeographers. I broke this down into vertebrates, invertebrates, plants, fungi, and microbes. Okay, and as you can see here, vertebrates are kind of the big popular theme. And you get a little bit of a scattering of plants and invertebrates elsewhere. Again, Australia is big on invertebrates, and the Palearctic region is pretty big on plants and invertebrates. The summary here is that vertebrates are studied much more frequently than other groups. Plants and invertebrates are frequently studied in the Palearctic, invertebrates in the Australian region. Fungi are infrequent, and I didn't detect microbial studies at all. They may be out there, but they didn't use the terms that came up with studies, okay? So that's a big open door for future development, I think. And I think it would be very, very interesting to introduce sort of a microbial component into this whole sphere. Okay, oh, and here's just another interesting kind of a breakdown. Most studies are terrestrial or semi-aquatic studies, although there are a fair number of aquatic studies in the Nearctic and Palearctic and Australian. But, so it's kind of interesting, even though Birmingham and Avise introduced this whole approach in 1986 with freshwater fish, most of the studies are terrestrial or semi-terrestrial organisms at this point. So there's an open door there as well. Genomes, or combination of genomes, Brian talked about the caveman genome, so let's follow up on that theme a little bit. Organelle DNA, I included mitochondrial and chloroplast DNA, versus nuclear DNA, and I included everything that was nuclear, just in this rough summary. You can see here that organelle DNA is quite popular. Organelle and nuclear DNA in studies is quite popular. Nuclear DNA alone, without addition of some organelle aspect, is not as popular yet, anyway. Okay, so, and if you look at that through time, you might ask whether the use of organelle genomes has decreased as the use of nuclear DNA has increased over the last decade or so. Certainly nuclear DNA has increased, but it doesn't appear that organelle DNA has decreased in frequency, which is kind of interesting. Kind of goes to Brian's comment earlier about it kind of works. So if we summarize here, organelle DNA-based studies are still as frequent or more frequent than nuclear DNA-based studies. When nuclear DNA is used, studies usually still include organelle DNA as well. And the use of organelle DNA has not decreased appreciably as nuclear DNA has increased. So we can ask some questions here, and I just asked the questions. I'm not going to answer them up here. It's something to talk about perhaps as we go along throughout the meeting. Is it because of the ease and cost of using organelle genomes? Is it because it's still a best first approximation of geographic structure that then provides very legitimately, I think, a baseline for hypothesis testing with additional genetics and additional taxa? Or more directly, in a comparative phylogeographic context, is it because the simplicity of the organelle genomes perhaps allow a more direct contrast and analytical sort of a framework to compare across very disparate kinds of taxa and organisms. And so, for example, in an approximate Bayesian computation framework, you see still more studies with organelle-based data across taxa than I think you do with nuclear taxa. I could be wrong. I may not have picked them up, but I think you do. Okay. Okay, so let's get to some more interesting kind of predictions and what's going on, some highlights. I admit that this is a very subjective and biased set of highlights, and all of you can add additional highlights as you wish, and we can talk about them. Obviously, there's been introduction of species distribution modeling or ecological niche modeling or paleodistribution models into phylogeography. Within a comparative phylogeography realm, they're there, but they don't seem to be overwhelmingly popular yet. I think if you go to single species, single taxon phylogeography, you see quite a few more studies that use species distribution modeling. Again, for whatever reason, I would think that there's a lot of opportunity for growth here, because I think it would be very interesting in a lot of cases, once you get into a system and a multi-taxon system, to be able to compare and contrast the distribution models themselves across taxa for predictions about responses, past responses, and predicted future responses. So I think there's some growth in that area to do. Here's one that I think is a theme that is sort of a paradigm shift in biogeography, and I think it's been driven by comparative phylogeography to a large extent, and I think it'll have some implications in terms of the kinds of questions people will ask into the future. So when we talk about congruence or concordance across co-distributed taxa, I would make the statement, as more and more kinds of taxa are added to continental comparative phylogeography hotspots, the likelihood of obtaining a signal of what we call pseudocongruence across one or more barriers will rise rapidly. Now, what's pseudocongruence? It's false congruence, obviously. If it's temporal pseudocongruence, what it means here, as illustrated here, is that if you have a time axis and you have a purple and a green co-distributed set of taxa with different species on either side of a barrier, they may superficially look like they all shared the same isolation event, which we would call traditionally something like simple vicariance. But in fact, they diverged at different time frames, and so they did not share the same isolation event. That barrier has been stable, presumably. It might be a climatic barrier that oscillates between glacial and interglacial times. Maybe it opens sometimes, maybe it closes other times. But nevertheless, whatever it is, it's generating diversity across a long time frame, okay? So I think these are very interesting. Here's a very good example from a couple of years ago. Brian Smith and his collaborators, it's good because it's very complete. They looked at cross-barrier divergence estimates using an ABC framework, using 27 species and 26 genera of neotropical birds. And here's just a depiction of the wide variety of kinds of birds they had. And they divided these birds into those that might disperse more readily, that is, those from a canopy dwellers, versus those that might not disperse as easily, being the understory dwellers. So that's what the green and the yellow bar are. The green are the canopy, and the yellow are the understory species. But if you turn your attention to the top graph, you have five different barriers that are looked at here, going from left, the Andes, the Isthmus of Panama, the Negro River, the Amazon River, and the Madeira River. And the horizontal axis is time in millions of years, and you can pick up two things here. One, that there's a wide range of time frames across each of these barriers at which they estimate divergence time in different species. And two, you can kind of get a sense that these canopy dwellers, more recent time is to the left, the canopy dwellers are generally younger divergence events than the understory birds. So you have sort of an ecological component to this study that is interesting, and you've got also sort of looking forward into the future, you've got lots of taxa being used rather than 2 or 3 species in a single genus, 2 genera, 4 species, something like that. Lots of co-distributed taxa. It's the kind of thing that people like Mike Hickerson have been advocating for a long time, sort of a community level comparative phylogeography. So it's going in that direction. And you've got both a combination of mitochondrial DNA and next-gen sequencing data over 100 loci. So you've got all these things going on, which is why it got into science, I guess. But we can pick up evidence of pseudocongruence in a wide range of systems around the world already. And I would just mention a few, and many of you probably know of others. We have that in the North American Southwest Airlands. Adam Lichet and collaborators did that in 2007, a nice paper on Baja California. And I think there's a lot more going on in the Southwest Airlands, by the way. I can talk to you about that later. In southeastern North America, Soltis et al. Put together a nice paper a few years ago that suggested that provided evidence. Lower Central American fishes look like they show signals of pseudocongruence. The Australian wet tropics show signals of pseudocongruence. There's a recent paper on some invertebrates that shows some very ancient splits across the biogeographic barriers there. And the Beringian crossing between the Palearctic and Nearctic show different times and different groups of crossing that route. So that shows an interest in these biotic interchange events and how they might happen. So simple vicariance is likely to become a rare response to Earth history at a continental scale. And this is some combination of biological and ecological traits and the way that barriers form within continental margins. And I think, it has implications for how we look at how speciation works. Do we have a whole bunch of speciation pumps around the world at stable barriers? Might be very interesting at some point to kind of do some meta-analyses on that. Here's another topic. We'll design more studies to explicitly address ecology, life history, and physiological traits that underlie variation among co-distributed species. Geographic architecture is a topic, speciation and consequences of incomplete reproductive isolation upon secondary contact, adaptation, including rates and ecological contexts, and the genes that are involved in adaptation are all legitimate topics. Whether species niches are conserved or whether they evolve under changing climates is a very interesting topic. And perhaps this is associated with range expansion events. Okay, here's just one example from the Southwest deserts. For those of you that are not mammalogists, these are kangaroo rats. Beautiful little animals. I love them. Anyway, there is a desert kangaroo rat and a Merriam's kangaroo rat in this case. They're very diverse animals, actually, lots of species. But in this case, we have a 2-species comparison between the western deserts, hot deserts in the south, going up into the Great Basin, the western Great Basin, up along western Nevada. And the key parameters here that are of interest is that they're co-distributed. One is a substrate specialist on sand, one is a substrate generalist not on sand. That's a typo. It's a substrate generalist on lots of different desert substrates, okay? Both in mitochondrial DNA show clear evidence of range expansion, of recent range expansion events northward. The species distribution models show nice reconstructions at the LGM of hot desert refugia to the south in both species. And then the RADseq SNP data shows what would be predicted. The specialist in several different parameters actually does tend to lose diversity more rapidly as that range expansion goes from south to north than does the generalist, okay? So these kinds of comparisons, I think, are very interesting for the future and really introduced ecology as a legitimate variable into future comparative phylogeography studies. Geology, paleoclimatology, and paleontology. We tend to traditionally read a geology paper and try to get an estimate of time from anybody that's read geology papers, they're really hard to read. All you want to go to the conclusion and say, that barrier formed there, then, you know. But it would be nice, actually, to more upfront, a priori, actually work with geologists, you know, and paleoclimatologists to actually start developing this sort of reciprocal interaction between Earth history and biotic history, okay? And let me just give you an example of how this could be beneficial. There's a lot of data on phylogeography of organisms on the Baja California Peninsula at this point. This very recent paper by Greer Dolby and her collaborators summarized phylogeographic data from 85 taxa, widely taxonomically distributed taxa, and came up with some hot spots and cold spots of diversity and several different indices. You do see this overall mid-peninsular diversity hotspot. And there's been a lot of talk in the past about putative mid-peninsular seaways between the Pacific and the Sea of Cortez at different points along the peninsula. The most popular one has been this right here called the Vizcaíno Seaway, right along the middle of the peninsula. But there's been no geological evidence that the seaway actually existed at that point. And so what do you do as a phylogeographer? Well, you go out and you, she was a doctoral student at UCLA, and she kind of decided she needed to become a geologist as well, or collaborate up front with geologists as well. I don't know what different people call themselves, but a geophylogeographer. Anyway, I just made that up. At any rate, okay, so they got together with and did some geological reconstructions of the peninsula. And very, very briefly, they came up with the idea that there's no reason to reject seaways across the peninsula, one or more seaways, in a late Miocene time frame. But in a late Pliocene-Pleistocene time frame, the geology pretty much rejects that there could have been seaways across the peninsula at that point in time. So if you have phylogeographic breaks north and south that date to that time frame, you probably have to start thinking a little more creatively than just a seaway that separated populations, okay? And, you know, elsewhere, we all know, geology, I think what I want to emphasize here, geology for biologists seems to be sort of a strong statement of Earth history. Geology is just as much a testable and rejectable hypothesis as is biology. So you got to be careful when you listen to somebody talk about the date of an uplift of a plateau or a mountain range or something like that. The geologists themselves, attack each other just as much as biologists do about their hypotheses. Here's a very, very interesting one. Brian mentioned the canonical date for the closure of the Isthmus of Panama was about 3 million years ago. That's what biogeographers have had to go on for decades, ever since George Gaylord Simpson, basically, in the 1950s. Just recently, sort of a radical group of geologists have been cobbling together evidence from river flow and sedimentary basins and so forth, that perhaps that closure of that isthmus would date back as early as 10 to 15 million years ago. That's a radically different time frame than the canonical 3 million years or so that we've all been taught and that we all teach, okay? That would, if that were true, that would be really interesting because there are things like ground sloths and freshwater fish and so forth that biogeographers have always had to sort of construct some sort of ad hoc hypotheses about island hopping and that sort of thing to reconcile the fossil record that they actually got to North America earlier than 3 million years ago. This might actually reconcile in a very parsimonious way that ground sloths don't swim between islands necessarily. Okay, biodiversity hotspots. There's a lot of room for development within a comparative phylogeographic framework of the foundational database for recognizing the distribution of biodiversity. I'll be interested in, hopefully, one of your earlier Sackler symposia, I hope that volume's still available when I get out there, on biodiversity. So here's just, but one of the things that I think is really interesting is if you get enough data in one of these conservation, or one of these phylogeography hotspots, you can actually put together a fairly fine scale and localized sense of hotspots. We all talk about global biodiversity hotspots, but in practice, those only go so far in terms of allowing people to actually develop on-the-ground planning efforts to save some pieces of real estate that are valuable. So here's the Mojave Desert, and this group of people took a lot of data, phylogeographic data, and developed an index of hotspots in genetic divergence and genetic diversity. And one can see that at a relatively local level, for example, in A here, that's all kinds of off-road vehicles and urban development. That's Victorville, but it's a biodiversity hotspot. So at any rate, you can see that throughout. At least there's the potential to bring sort of this idea of biodiversity down to a scale, a spatial scale, that can be used actually by resource managers if they choose to do so. Of course, there's a bunch of ranchers in Southeast Oregon right now that want to give all this back to the ranchers, and then we'll get nowhere. Okay, so finally, my last slide. There's a lot of opportunity for comparative phylogeography to be folded into and incorporated within a much broader integrative, what Juan Morón called evolutionary biogeography. It's a decent name, okay? But what he really did is, that was innovative, was rather than continuing the back and forth bickering between different schools, the pan-biogeographers and the bicarian cladistic biogeographers and so forth, and the quantitative biogeographers. He said that at different levels within an expanded framework of the objectives of an evolutionary biogeography program that ultimately gets at what he called the geobiotic scenario, phylogeography has a place in there, and I think it would be up to the phylogeographers to actually expand the definition of what that place ought to look like within biogeography generally. Okay, that's it. I'd like to thank the organizers again.